There are places lost beneath the ice, places where time stands still and the past whispers through the cold. Tonight, we journey into the Arctic's deepest mysteries, abandoned stations, forgotten civilizations, and echoes of something waiting beneath the snow. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the Arctic pull you into its frozen unknown. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Lights of the Ice Horizon. The Arctic night stretched endlessly, a frozen expanse untouched by time, where the sky shimmered with the eerie glow of the aurora borealis. Beneath the wavering lights, the landscape lay silent, a vast, icy desert where only the wind dared to whisper. But in the isolated research station of Svalbard, that silence was broken by an anomaly, a phenomenon that defied explanation. Dr. Elias Thornton had spent years studying the Arctic's shifting climates, documenting the subtle changes in the permafrost. But nothing in his scientific career had prepared him for what he saw one night in the frozen stillness. A light, brighter than the northern glow, pulsed on the distant horizon, hovering like a beacon beyond the reach of logic. It was not the flickering dance of the aurora, nor the dim haze of a far-off settlement. This light moved with intention, cutting through the darkness like a distant call. The research station's radios had been silent for days, disrupted by an inexplicable interference that clouded transmissions. Elias had dismissed it as a geomagnetic anomaly, a result of the Earth's restless energy. But as the days passed, the interference grew worse, and the light on the horizon seemed to come closer. One evening, unable to ignore the pull of the unknown, Elias set out with two of his colleagues, Dr. Ingrid Meyer and technician Daniel Holt, to find the source of the light. The three of them trekked through the frozen wasteland, their breath misting in the frigid air. The landscape was unyielding, vast sheets of ice stretched infinitely, broken only by the occasional jagged crevasse. But through it all, the light remained, steady and unwavering, leading them deeper into the Arctic's heart. As they pressed forward, the air around them grew dense, as though charged with unseen energy. Their compasses faltered, spinning without direction, and their GPS devices flickered erratically. Then, without warning, the light vanished. The land before them, once illuminated by its glow, was now shrouded in the deep darkness of the polar night. A silence heavier than the cold settled around them. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat beneath the ice. It resonated through the frozen ground, sending vibrations through their boots. Elias exchanged uneasy glances with Ingrid and Daniel. There was something beneath them, something ancient and unseen. Daniel knelt, pressing a gloved hand to the ice. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. His voice barely carried in the heavy air. Ingrid nodded, eyes wide. "It's coming from below." Elias unshouldered his pack, pulling out a portable drill used for ice core sampling. As the bit touched the surface, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Then, with a sudden crack, the ice split open beneath them. The ground gave way, and they tumbled into the abyss below. Darkness swallowed them whole. The fall was brief but disorienting, their descent cushioned by layers of powdery snow. When they finally came to rest, the light returned, this time, not from the horizon but from the cavern around them. Walls of crystalline ice refracted an otherworldly glow, pulsating as if alive. At the center of the cavern stood a structure, an enormous monolith buried beneath the ice for untold centuries. Its surface shimmered with an unnatural sheen, and strange symbols, glowing faintly, adorned its towering form. The pulsating sound was stronger here, resonating from within the monolith itself. Ingrid stepped forward, tracing her gloved fingers over the ancient carvings. "This isn't natural," she murmured. "It's not even human." Elias could only nod. The Arctic had always been a land of secrets, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The monolith pulsed again, and the ice around them trembled. They were not alone down here. Something had awakened. Chapter 2. Echoes beneath the ice. The cavern hummed with an unseen force, a resonance that sent tremors through the ice walls. Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel stood frozen, their breath fogging the air in shallow puffs. The monolith before them pulsed again, the symbols glowing brighter, as if sensing their presence. Daniel took a cautious step forward, raising his flashlight to illuminate the towering structure. "This thing, it's responding to us," he murmured. The moment his light touched the symbols, a ripple coursed through the ice beneath their feet. A deep groan echoed through the cavern, the sound ancient and full of warning. "Step back," Ingrid hissed, grabbing Daniel's arm. But it was too late. The floor beneath them shifted, cracking like glass under pressure. A gust of warm air rushed from below, carrying with it the scent of something old, something untouched by time. Elias gritted his teeth. "We need to document this. Whatever this is, it predates human civilization. It could change everything we know about this region." Ingrid nodded but kept her eyes locked on the monolith. "Or it could be something we were never meant to find." Before Elias could respond, the symbols flared to life, bathing the cavern in a soft spectral glow. The pulsating sound grew louder, rhythmic, like a language beyond human comprehension. Then the ice around the monolith began to shift. Thin fractures spread like veins, revealing a deeper chamber below. Daniel, ever the skeptic, knelt at the edge of the forming fissure. "It's hollow underneath. There's something down there." A gust of wind, impossibly warm for the Arctic, rose from the depths, carrying a whispering sound that sent chills down their spines. The words were not in any language they recognized, but the intent was clear. Something was calling them forward. Elias adjusted his headlamp and exhaled sharply. "We came this far. We can't turn back now." With careful steps, they began their descent into the unknown. The cavern below was unlike anything they had ever seen. The ice walls shimmered with a strange bioluminescent glow, casting ghostly shadows as they moved deeper. The air was thick with humidity, an unnatural warmth in a place that should have been frozen solid. As they moved, the ground beneath their feet felt strangely uneven, like stepping on something that wasn't entirely ice. Daniel paused, kneeling to inspect the surface. "This isn't just ice. It's organic. Like frozen tissue." Ingrid stiffened. "That's impossible. We're standing on something alive." Elias shined his flashlight downward, and for the first time, he noticed the texture of the ice beneath them. It had a pattern, ridges and grooves that looked disturbingly like veins. A slow realization crept over him. This wasn't just a cavern. It was something much larger. A sudden tremor rattled the chamber, and from deep within the monolith, a sound reverberated through the space. A slow, deep thrum, like the beating of a colossal heart. Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel exchanged wary glances, the weight of the discovery settling on them like a crushing force. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "We're not alone down here." As if responding to his words, the ground beneath them shifted. A low, resonant vibration pulsed through the chamber, followed by a distant, echoing groan, something waking from a long slumber. The air thickened, the walls of ice, trembling, as if alive. The warmth intensified, and suddenly, an eerie glow spread through the cavern, illuminating structures hidden in the ice. Dark, towering spires rose in the distance, their surfaces smooth and impossibly ancient. Elias tightened his grip on his pack. "We need to document everything." But before he could reach for his camera, the glow pulsed again, and the cavern was flooded with an otherworldly hum. A deep voice, neither male nor female, neither human nor machine, whispered through the chamber, "You have awakened us." The words were not spoken aloud, but felt pressing into their minds like a memory not their own. A cold dread settled over them as the realization dawned. They had stumbled upon something far older than human civilization, something that had been waiting beneath the ice for far too long. The monolith trembled, and the walls of the cavern began to crack. A shifting sound, like ice being rearranged by unseen hands, filled the chamber. The symbols on the monolith glowed even brighter, their light casting strange, flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Ingrid took a step back, clutching at Elias's arm. This isn't just an artifact, it's an entrance. Elias's stomach churned as the realization took hold. An entrance to what? Before either of them could speculate further, the ground gave another violent shudder. Ice splintered and fell away, revealing an even deeper abyss below. From its depths, tendrils of mist curled upward, thick with the scent of minerals and something more, something ancient and alive. Daniel stumbled forward, peering into the abyss. This goes down further than we thought. We need to send a signal back to the station. Elias reached for his radio, but only static greeted him. The interference that had plagued them before was even stronger now. It was as if something was blocking their communication, something intelligent. A faint light flickered in the abyss below, pulsing in harmony with the monolith's hum. The cavern was no longer silent. Whispers surrounded them, soft and unintelligible, like a chorus of voices just beyond their understanding. Ingrid gritted her teeth. We either leave now, or we go down there. But if we go, we might not come back. Elias hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, but something deeper, some unexplainable pull, urged him forward. This was a discovery beyond imagination, beyond reason. We document, Elias finally said. And then we decide. Daniel exhaled sharply. Fine, but I don't like this. As they prepared their gear, a final pulse from the monolith sent a vibration through the cavern floor. Then slowly, with an almost mechanical precision, a staircase began to emerge from the abyss, one made of solid ice, yet smooth and polished like glass. Elias swallowed hard. Looks like we have our answer. Ingrid's eyes remained locked on the descending steps. Something wants us to go down. As they stepped forward, the last remnants of light from the surface began to fade, and the whispers grew louder. The Arctic had always held secrets, but this one had been waiting for an eternity. Chapter 3. The Descent into the Unknown. The first step onto the icy staircase sent a vibration through Elias's boots, a faint but noticeable hum that echoed deep into the abyss. Ingrid hesitated, her breath slow, and measured as she peered into the black void below. The staircase, impossibly smooth and polished, spiraled downward, disappearing into the mist that curled upward in eerie tendrils. Daniel swallowed hard. Are we really doing this? Elias adjusted his headlamp. We document, we move cautiously, and if anything feels off, we turn back. No one voiced what they were all thinking. What if turning back was no longer an option? Step by step, they descended. The air grew warmer, defying the Arctic chill that should have consumed them. Their boots clanked against the ice, yet it felt softer beneath them, almost pliant. The whispering sounds intensified, curling around them like unseen figures watching their every move. Ingrid's fingers tightened on the strap of her pack. These carvings, they're becoming more intricate. Indeed, the walls of the abyss had begun to change. The jagged ice gave way to smooth, polished surfaces etched with swirling patterns, symbols resembling those on the monolith above. As Elias ran a gloved hand over one, a faint pulse of light followed his touch, reacting as if alive. This isn't just natural formation, he murmured. This place was built. Daniel scoffed but kept his voice low. Built by who? No one's ever been this deep. Under the ice. A new sound joined the whispering, dripping water. The first true sign of liquid they had encountered in this frozen wasteland. The mist thickened, curling around their legs, distorting their vision with every step. The deeper they descended, the less the space around them felt like a cavern, and more like an immense hidden structure buried beneath the Arctic for untold millennia. Then, suddenly, the staircase ended. They stood at the entrance of an enormous chamber, so vast their headlamps barely illuminated its farthest edges. The floor, though appearing to be ice, was smooth as polished stone, stretching out into darkness. Towering columns lined the space, their surfaces carved with spirals that pulsed with faint luminescence. The air was thick, humid and charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. Daniel let out a slow breath. This is unreal. Elias took a cautious step forward, testing the ground. We're walking into something ancient. Be careful. As they moved deeper into the chamber, the walls began to glow, revealing even more intricate carvings. Murals, vast sweeping depictions of humanoid figures standing beneath an immense radiant object in the sky. Strange symbols surrounded the figures, their meaning lost to time. Ingrid traced a gloved finger along the carvings. These figures, they don't look entirely human. Look at their proportions, the elongated limbs, the way their eyes are depicted. Elias exhaled, his voice barely a whisper. Who or what lived here? A sudden pulse of light shot through the chamber. The ground trembled, and from the far end of the space, something stirred. A shape moved within the mist, tall and deliberate. The air grew dense, pressing in on them from all sides. Then the voice returned, deep, resonant, not spoken aloud, but pressed directly into their minds. You were not meant to find this place. The temperature plummeted, a pressure settled in their chests, making it hard to breathe. The shadows ahead coalesced into something more defined, something moving toward them with slow, purposeful steps. Ingrid reached for Elias's arm. We need to leave. Now. But as they turned, the staircase behind them was gone. The passage they had descended had vanished, replaced by an unbroken wall of ice. Daniel's voice was tight with panic. No, no, no. Where's the exit? The whispering voices rose to a chorus, filling the air like 1,000 overlapping murmurs. The mist curled around their feet, pulling them deeper into the chamber, and in the center of it all, the figure stepped into the dim glow of their headlamps. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its form was tall and slender, its body covered in something neither flesh nor ice, shimmering in the pale light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were voids of inky blackness, absorbing all light that touched them. And yet there was no malice in its posture, no immediate threat. Just patience, watching, waiting. Then in the same voiceless way, it spoke again. You have come too soon. Elias could barely find his voice. Who are you? What is this place? The figure tilted its head, its gaze unwavering. You stand in the hollow of memory, a vault of what was and what should have never been. The air trembled. A deep rhythmic sound reverberated through the walls, the same hum they had heard above, now impossibly louder. The columns around them pulsed with new intensity, their carvings shifting, rearranging as if the structure itself was alive. Daniel's voice cracked. What do you mean too soon? What's going to happen? The figure took a step closer, and in that moment, the mist parted, revealing something behind it. A gateway. A doorway carved of the same luminous ice, its surface swirling like liquid glass, and beyond it, shadows moved, shapes that did not belong to this world. Elias felt his stomach drop. This is not just a lost civilization. This is something else entirely. The figure extended a hand, motioning toward the gateway. You have two choices. Wake the forgotten, or return before it is too late. The chamber rumbled, the walls beginning to crack. The decision had to be made. And whatever choice they made, there would be no turning back. Chapter 4. The threshold of shadows. Elias's breath was shallow, his fingers curling into a fist as he stared at the figure before them. The creature, or whatever it was, remained still, its form shifting slightly in the dim light, as if it wasn't entirely bound to this world. The weight of the choice it had given them pressed heavily against his chest. Behind it, the swirling doorway pulsed like a slow heartbeat, its liquid-like surface distorting shadows that moved just beyond. The air carried a scent, faint, almost imperceptible, like ancient stone and something else, something unfamiliar, something neither ice nor earth. It was the smell of time itself, worn thin by centuries unknown. Ingrid swallowed hard. Wake the forgotten. What does that mean? The figure's voice did not come from its mouth, but reverberated directly within their minds. The choice is not yours alone. The ones who came before you made it long ago. Now the cycle begins again. Daniel shifted uneasily, his hand tightening around the strap of his pack. Cycle? Wait, others have been here before? Who? When? The figure tilted its head slightly. They are part of this place now. Their echoes remain. A sudden tremor rippled beneath their feet, the columns along the chamber's walls glowing with an intensified light. The mist thickened, swirling around their legs, urging them forward. It seemed almost sentient, curling around their ankles as though trying to pull them deeper into the chamber. Elias forced himself to steady his breathing. What happens if we go through that door? You will see. You will know. But knowledge is not without cost. A deep, rhythmic sound pulsed through the chamber, growing louder. It was not the sound of ice shifting, nor the wind howling through caverns. It was something deeper, something alive. A feeling of something vast and watching pressed against them, unseen but undeniable. The walls pulsed as if responding to the sound, the carvings shifting, realigning, showing glimpses of something more. Ingrid looked between the figure and the pulsing gateway. And if we refuse? If we turn back? For the first time, something akin to sadness flickered in the figure's inky black eyes. There is no turning back, only forward, in one way or another. A new sound emerged, distant at first, then growing nearer. A whispering chorus, layered with countless voices, speaking in tongues they did not understand. The walls of the chamber seemed to shift, the carvings rearranging themselves, depicting something new, scenes of people, explorers, standing where they stood now, and in each depiction, they faced the gateway. Some had stepped through, others had not. And those who had remained, their figures twisted, their forms dissolving into the walls, their faces frozen in silent horror. Their bodies were not lost, but absorbed into the very stone, their expressions warped in eternal anguish, their outstretched hands forever reaching for an escape that never came. Daniel took a step back, shaking his head. No, I'm not ending up like them. I say we move, we go through. Elias hesitated. The gateway pulsed again, its swirling surface reflecting fragmented images, mountains that didn't exist, skies with shifting colors, ruins too vast to comprehend. Among them, figures loomed in the distance, watching, waiting. They weren't human, at least, not anymore. Ingrid touched his arm. Elias, we're out of time. The ground trembled once more. The figure raised its hand, palm outward, as if granting them permission. Step forward, or be claimed by the hollow. A gust of icy wind rushed past them, pulling toward the gateway, beckoning them onward. A noise low and guttural vibrated from deep within the swirling portal, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. The pressure in the chamber became unbearable, like standing at the edge of a great abyss, the unseen presence behind the veil pushing them toward the threshold of the unknown. Elias exchanged one last glance with Ingrid and Daniel before making his choice. And then with one last breath, they stepped through. The world dissolved around them. Darkness swallowed them whole, a cold, consuming void. Then, all at once, the sensation of falling, endless, weightless, until suddenly, the ground met them once more. But it was not ice, not rock, not anything they had ever known. They were somewhere else, and something was waiting for them. Chapter 5. Beneath the frozen veil. A shuddering breath filled Elias's lungs as he landed on solid ground. The darkness that had consumed them moments ago seemed to unravel like a veil, dissipating into a heavy mist that clung to their skin. The air was dense and damp, carrying an eerie stillness that contrasted with the howling winds of the world they had left behind. Ingrid groaned beside him, slowly pushing herself up from the strange stone-like surface beneath them. It was smooth, too smooth, unnatural in its perfection. Daniel's voice was hoarse as he whispered, "Where are we?" They weren't in the cavern anymore, nor were they outside in the Arctic wasteland. Instead, an expanse stretched before them, an impossible city hidden beneath the ice. Towering spires of crystalline stone glowed with an internal pulsing light, casting soft, shifting shadows along streets paved with geometric patterns that seemed to hum with energy. The sky above them was not the sky at all, but a dome of swirling darkness, like the night sky condensed into a thick, liquid void. "This isn't possible," Elias muttered, his breath forming faint mist in the unnatural air. Ingrid pointed toward one of the distant spires. "Look, there's movement." A flicker of shadow wove between the structures, too swift and fluid to be human. More followed, tall, elongated figures moving with an eerie grace, their outlines blurred as if they weren't entirely bound to physical form. The whispering voices from the cavern still echoed faintly around them, layered upon each other like fragments of a forgotten language. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his boots making no sound against the smooth ground. "Are they the ones who came before us? The ones who chose to step through?" A low, resonant hum pulsed through the air, vibrating through their bones. The spires brightened momentarily, as if responding to an unseen command. Then a deep voice, neither hostile nor welcoming, spoke from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You have come, as they have, as they always will." The figures in the distance halted, their luminous eyes turning toward the newcomers. Elias swallowed hard. "Who are you? What is this place?" A pause. Then the voice spoke again. "You stand within the veil, the threshold between what was and what will be." Daniel exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer." The shadows began to move, advancing toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Their forms remained undefined, shifting between clarity and distortion, as if seen through rippling water. "Knowledge is a burden. You have chosen to carry it. The veil does not grant freely. It tests." A chill ran down Ingrid's spine. "Tests? What kind of tests?" The whispering chorus grew louder, swirling around them like a living wind. The figures stopped mere feet away, their presence radiating an unnatural stillness. Then, as if answering Ingrid's question, the mist coiled upward, revealing something new. Figures frozen in place, their faces locked in expressions of shock, fear, and despair. Some wore tattered explorer gear. Others bore signs of a civilization far older than anything known to history. Their bodies were untouched by decay, perfectly preserved by forces unknown. Elias clenched his jaw. "They failed." The deep voice resonated again. "Some seek, some find, some remain." The weight of the words settled over them. Whatever lay ahead was more than just a mystery waiting to be uncovered. It was a trial, one that many had attempted and few had survived. The mist parted further, revealing an archway etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. It stood at the entrance to what looked like an ancient structure, half buried beneath the shifting ground. Beyond it, shadows swirled, hiding whatever lay within. "Proceed," the voice commanded, "or become part of the veil." The city pulsed with quiet expectation, watching, waiting. Elias exhaled. There was no turning back now. They stepped forward, beneath the frozen veil, into the unknown. Chapter 6. Beneath an unfamiliar sky. The moment Elias stepped through the gateway, the world as he knew it ceased to exist. There was no transition, no sensation of movement, only the abrupt shift from one reality to another. His boots landed on ground that wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite earth. It had the texture of stone but the give of sand, shifting slightly beneath his weight, yet firm enough to hold him. The air was thin yet charged, crackling faintly as if infused with static energy. His breath came in short, uncertain gasps as he took in his surroundings. The sky stretched endlessly above him, but it wasn't the sky of the Arctic. It wasn't the sky of Earth. There were no clouds, no northern lights, no stars he recognized. Instead, celestial bodies shimmered in unnatural hues, twisting and reforming as if they were alive. Some moved in slow, deliberate patterns, while others pulsed erratically, like distant embers of a fire too vast to comprehend. Behind him, Daniel staggered forward, his hands gripping his knees as he caught his breath. "What the hell?" His voice carried strangely, the sound thinner, stretched, as though the air itself resisted it. Ingrid appeared next, her footing unsteady as she landed beside them. She spun on her heels to look behind her, just in time to witness the portal collapse. Its swirling surface unraveled, the edges curling inward like burnt paper before vanishing into nothingness. She swallowed hard. We can't go back. The words settled over them like a weight. Daniel let out a sharp exhale. Fantastic, stuck in whatever this is. Elias barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the land before them, if it could even be called that. The terrain stretched out in endless undulating patterns. Vast ridges rose in impossible shapes, their surfaces etched with markings that pulsed with a dim, eerie light. Some resembled letters, but none from any known language. Others looked like constellations, though none he recognized. But it was the movement beneath the surface that unsettled him the most. The ground breathed. It expanded and contracted ever so slightly, as though the entire landscape were alive. "We're not alone here," Elias murmured. The moment the words left his mouth, the sky flickered. A deep, resonant sound rippled through the air. A hum, low and powerful, vibrating through their bones. Daniel stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Ingrid nodded. Her grip tightened on her jacket, as if trying to hold onto something tangible. "It's not just a sound. I can feel it." The humming grew stronger, and with it, a presence. Then they saw it. A structure loomed in the distance, towering over the shifting landscape. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, vast, impossibly ancient, its dark stone shimmering with an inner luminescence. The symbols carved into its surface slithered and rearranged themselves, forming patterns that made Elias's stomach turn. The entrance was open, a yawning black void. Daniel let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah, because that doesn't scream horrible ideas at all." Elias ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on the structure, on the way the darkness within seemed to move, shifting and waiting. "We don't have a choice," Ingrid said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias turned to her. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the ground. He followed her gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. The land was changing. Behind them, where they had once stood, the ground was dissolving. Not breaking, not cracking, dissolving. The particles that made up the terrain were unraveling, spiraling upward in slow, shimmering tendrils before vanishing entirely. Daniel took a step back. Oh hell no. The dissolving land spread faster, devouring the terrain at an accelerating pace. "We need to move," Elias said sharply. They broke into a run. The ground trembled beneath them, shifting unpredictably with every step. Their breath came ragged, their limbs heavy as though an unseen force resisted them. The hum in the air grew louder, deeper, vibrating through their skulls. The whispers came next. Soft at first, just at the edge of perception. Then all at once clear. "They are watching," Elias nearly stopped mid-stride. The voices layered, countless, spoke in unison, as though 1,000 unseen figures stood just beyond their vision. Daniel cursed under his breath. "Tell me that was one of you." No one answered. They reached the structure. The entrance loomed before them, massive, unwelcoming, yet undeniably beckoning. Up close, the symbols covering its walls moved faster, reacting to their presence. Some pulsed with faint recognition. Others twisted violently, as though warning them away. Elias hesitated at the threshold. The darkness inside was unlike any he had ever seen. Not the absence of light, but something deeper, something sentient. "We go in," Ingrid said, her voice firm. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Yeah? And what if we don't?" Behind them, the land continued to vanish. Elias took a breath. "We go in." And together they stepped forward. The darkness swallowed them whole. At first there was nothing. Then a corridor, dimly lit. Walls of shifting stone, covered in symbols that moved like liquid. The air carried the scent of something old, something forgotten. Footsteps echoed ahead of them. Not theirs. Something else was inside. Waiting, watching. Elias clenched his fists. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead, they had no choice but to face it. Chapter 7. The Echoing Corridor. The moment they stepped into the structure, the darkness closed around them like a living thing, wrapping itself around their senses, pressing into their skin. It was not merely the absence of light, but something deeper, something ancient and aware. The air carried the weight of centuries, thick with dust and the faintest scent of metal, as though time itself had corroded within these walls. The ground beneath them was solid, yet it felt unnatural, pulsing faintly beneath their boots, as if the structure itself was breathing. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls carved with symbols that shifted in slow, deliberate patterns, rearranging themselves as if responding to their presence. The faint luminescence emanating from these carvings was the only source of light, casting elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The silence was oppressive, thick, and unbroken, save for the distant echo of their footsteps that seemed to stretch far beyond what was physically possible. Elias tightened his grip on his pack, his heartbeat slow and deliberate, his mind forcing itself into a state of focus. Ingrid walked beside him, her posture tense, every movement calculated. Daniel lagged slightly behind, his eyes darting from one shifting carving to another, his fingers grazing the stone as if trying to confirm that it was real. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured. The temperature had already been frigid outside, but this was something different, a still, suffocating chill that did not come from wind or ice, but seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. The sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore, pressing against them from every angle, from the unseen corners of the corridor, from the very stone beneath their feet. Then the whispers returned. Soft at first, a trickle of sound weaving through the silence, barely distinguishable from the humming vibration of the structure itself. Then, slowly, they became clearer. The voices were not human, yet there was something familiar in them, something almost recognizable, as if the words were just beyond the edge of understanding. The whispers layered over one another, some urgent, others distant and hollow, as though spoken from the depths of a place where light had never existed. Elias stopped walking, his breath shallow, his ears straining to decipher the words. The others halted beside him, their eyes scanning the corridor ahead. The voices were not coming from behind them, they were ahead, beyond the turn in the passage, waiting in the unseen depths of this ancient place. Ingrid's voice was barely above a whisper, "Do you hear that?" Daniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I wish I didn't." The symbols on the walls pulsed suddenly, their glow intensifying for a brief moment before dimming again, as if responding to something unseen. A deep, resonant sound vibrated through the structure, neither metallic nor organic, but something in between. The whispers ceased instantly, vanishing into the stillness, leaving only the heavy silence in their wake. Elias exhaled slowly, his voice steady but low. "We keep moving." With cautious steps they continued forward. As they neared the bend in the corridor, the passage widened, opening into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into darkness, while the walls bore intricate carvings that flickered with faint, ghostly light. The air was different here, denser, filled with an unspoken presence, as though the space itself was aware of their intrusion. At the center of the chamber stood a structure unlike anything they had encountered before. A towering monolith, carved from the same dark stone as the walls, rose from the floor, its surface etched with a spiral of symbols that shifted in slow, hypnotic patterns. The markings did not merely glow, they moved, their shapes morphing and rearranging themselves in a continuous, unreadable script. Ingrid exhaled sharply, her gaze locked on the monolith. "What is this place?" Daniel circled the structure cautiously, his fingers hovering inches from the carvings. "This isn't just a ruin, it's still functioning, it's alive." Elias stepped closer, his mind racing through possibilities. The structure wasn't just a remnant of something long past, it was active, humming with a quiet energy that pulsed in sync with the air itself. The moment he reached out and pressed his palm against the stone, the symbols flared with sudden brilliance, and the chamber trembled. A sound, low, resonant, vibrating through the air rippled through the space, and the darkness beyond the walls shifted. The silence was no longer empty. Something else was here. The monolith's glow intensified, and for the first time the shifting symbols stilled, forming a recognizable shape, a door. Not a carving, but something real, a seam in the stone that had not existed moments ago. It pulsed once, as though waiting for them to make a choice. Elias turned to the others, his voice calm but firm. "It's giving us a path." Daniel shook his head. "Or a trap." Ingrid's gaze remained fixed on the glowing threshold, her expression unreadable. "Either way, we're already too deep to turn back." The walls trembled once more, a slow vibration that resonated through the floor beneath them, urging them forward. Beyond the door, something stirred, waiting just beyond sight. The air pressed heavier against them, as if the structure itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if they would take the next step. Elias inhaled deeply, steadying himself before placing his hand on the door. The moment he did, the stone shifted beneath his touch, sliding open without a sound, revealing the darkness beyond. The passage ahead was narrow, stretching into the unknown, its walls lined with more carvings, more unreadable symbols that pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A choice lay before them: step forward into the unknown, or remain within the chamber, waiting for whatever unseen force had guided them here to decide their fate for them. Without a word, Elias stepped through the threshold. Ingrid followed. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before cursing under his breath and stepping in behind them. The door sealed behind them. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, the air thick with an unspoken presence. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, distorting and overlapping as though something else walked beside them, unseen. The deeper they ventured, the more the walls shifted, their surfaces becoming less like stone and more like something else, something alive, something ancient. Then, far ahead in the darkness, the symbols flared to life once more, and the whispers returned. But this time, they were not warnings, they were instructions, and they were not alone. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Passage. The chamber was silent, yet the air itself seemed to pulse with something unseen. A presence lingered in the unseen depths, not moving, not shifting, but merely existing in a way that could not be ignored. Elias felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, a sensation not entirely physical yet undeniably real. The carvings that lined the walls pulsed in a rhythmic glow, casting flickering shadows that did not move in the way they should have. The monolith stood at the center of it all, its surface alive with shifting symbols that rearranged themselves in fluid patterns too intricate to follow. Daniel and Ingrid stood close, their expressions wary. Ingrid took a slow step forward, her breath barely stirring the air around her. The silence had become so complete that even the smallest movement felt disruptive. It was as though they had entered a place where sound was not meant to exist, where even their presence was an intrusion upon something ancient and undisturbed. Elias exhaled carefully. "It's watching." Daniel frowned. "What is?" Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. It wasn't a single entity, not something with form or shape. It was the chamber itself, the air, the walls, the stone beneath their feet. There was no single presence to pinpoint because it was everywhere at once. Then, without warning, the monolith shifted. The slow, hypnotic movement of its surface grew sharper, more deliberate. The fluid symbols aligned, forming something structured, something meaningful. The entire space around them seemed to adjust in response, the walls trembling as if reacting to something unseen. And then, just beyond the monolith, something changed. A passage appeared, stretching into the darkness beyond. It had not been there before. Elias was sure of it. The corridor was wide, its walls lined with more of the same shifting symbols, yet there was something different about them. They were not active, not rearranging themselves like those on the monolith. They were still, etched deep into the stone, as though they had been placed there long ago and had not moved since. Ingrid's voice was barely a whisper. "It wasn't here before." Elias nodded. "It was always here. We just couldn't see it." The words felt true, though he couldn't explain why. There was an awareness in his mind now, a strange certainty that the monolith had not revealed the path so much as it had allowed them to perceive it. The passage had never been hidden, only their understanding of it had been clouded. Daniel hesitated at the threshold. "We don't know what's down there." Elias met his gaze. "We didn't know what was here either, but we kept moving." Without another word, he stepped forward, crossing into the passage. The moment his foot touched the stone, the air shifted. The walls pulsed once, the carvings dimming slightly, as if acknowledging their passage. Ingrid followed, and after a moment's hesitation, Daniel did the same. The deeper they walked, the more the sensation around them changed. The silence became something else, not merely the absence of sound, but an active force, as though the air itself was suppressing any noise they might have made. Their footsteps should have echoed, but the space devoured all sound before it could fully form. The corridor stretched onward, the darkness ahead layered in a way that made it difficult to judge distance. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though they were walking not through space, but through something else entirely. The walls bore marks of time, deep carvings that had eroded with age, remnants of something far older than anything they had encountered before. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched upward into darkness too high to see. The walls expanded outward, revealing a space carved from the same dark stone, its surface rippling with the remnants of symbols long faded. The air was heavier here, thick with something that pressed against them, unseen yet undeniable, and at the center of it all, there stood a door. It was unlike anything they had encountered. The material was unfamiliar, not quite stone, not quite metal, something between the two. Its surface was smooth, yet it carried a presence, a weight that could be felt without touch. The edges did not meet the surrounding stone in a natural way. They blurred together, as if the door had not been built, but had grown from the chamber itself. Symbols lined its frame. Unlike those in the passage, these were not shifting. They remained still, etched deep, unmoving. There was an intent behind them, a purpose. Elias reached out, his fingertips hovering just above the carvings. There was no temperature, no sensation of heat or cold. But there was something else, a pulse, an awareness, as if the door was not merely a barrier, but something alive. Ingrid's voice was quiet. "This is it." Daniel frowned. "This is what? A door? Where does it lead?" Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer. The carvings held no indication of what lay beyond, only that this threshold had remained sealed for a reason. And yet, the presence within the chamber remained. It was not behind them, not above, not below. It was here, in the very air, lingering just beyond their understanding. Elias exhaled and pressed his palm against the stone. The moment his skin met its surface, the symbols flared with a deep, slow light. The pulse in the air intensified, not as a noise, but as a presence. It pressed inward, wrapping around them, drawing them towards something unseen. The silence deepened, the air thickened. Then, with a sound that was not a sound, a shift, a change, a release, the door began to open. The darkness beyond was not empty, and something inside had been waiting for a very long time. Chapter 9. The Echo Beyond the Door. The door groaned as it shifted, the deep resonance of its movement reverberating through the chamber. It was not a mechanical sound, nor the scrape of stone against stone. It was something else, something that carried weight beyond the physical. The air trembled with it, as though the space itself was reacting to what was unfolding. Elias held his breath. The edges of the door shimmered, its surface pulling away in layers, dissolving like mist and reforming as it parted. The space beyond was a void, a shifting expanse of nothingness that was not truly empty. It pulsed, breathed, expanded and contracted like something alive. The darkness was deeper than mere absence of light. It was layered, endless, stretching far beyond the chamber's limits. For a moment nothing moved, and then a whisper. Not from the door, not from the chamber, from the void itself. It was not a voice, not words. It was something older, something buried within the fabric of existence, woven into the very essence of the air around them. It was a call, but not to them specifically. It had been echoing long before they arrived, long before they even existed. Daniel swallowed hard. What is this? Elias took a step forward. The ground beneath him was solid, yet it felt insubstantial, as though it could vanish at any moment. The void ahead was shifting, but it was not random. There was form within the depths, something moving, something waiting. Ingrid exhaled slowly. It's not empty. No, it wasn't. Shapes flickered within the darkness, silhouettes just beyond comprehension. They were not physical forms, not beings in the way they understood them, but echoes of something else. They did not walk or move in any way that could be described. They simply were. The pulse of the void deepened, and the door behind them began to close. Daniel spun, his hand reaching instinctively for the stone, but it was already sealing, reforming, as if it had never opened at all. The chamber behind them was lost, swallowed by the very same nothingness that stretched before them. There's no going back, Elias said quietly. The realization settled over them like a weight. They had passed through something more than a doorway. They had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. And the presence in the darkness had noticed them. A shift, a ripple. The void reacted, curling toward them in waves of unseen force. It was not wind, not movement in any traditional sense, but something deeper, an unseen current pulling them further in. Then came the whispers, not external, not in the air. They were within, threading through their thoughts, not as voices, but as impressions. Fragments of words in a language they could not understand, yet somehow they knew. The echoes of those who had stood here before. Elias tried to steady his breath. The whispers were not violent, not malicious, but they carried weight. They had belonged to those who had passed through this void long before them. Some had continued forward, some had been lost. Daniel tensed. I don't like this. Neither did Elias, but there was no choice. The void pulsed again, and something emerged. Not a figure, not a creature, a presence. It did not step forward, did not materialize in the way they expected. It simply became more there. A distortion in the darkness, a shifting of the air around it, not bound by form, not constrained by time. Elias felt it study them. It was not an entity of sight or sound, but of perception itself. It did not see with eyes, did not hear with ears, yet it knew they were there. And then it reached out. Not physically, not with a limb or a touch. It reached into them, into the spaces between thought and memory, brushing against the deepest recesses of their minds. Elias shuddered. Images flooded through him. Not his own, glimpses of places beyond comprehension, landscapes that should not exist, structures too vast, too intricate, built by hands that were not human, skies that did not obey the rules of time, shifting in ways that made no sense. And through it all, the feeling of something waiting. Not here, not in this void. Beyond it, the pulse of the presence deepened, and the whispers grew louder. It was not keeping them here. It was showing them the way forward. A path formed ahead, glowing, shifting beneath their feet, stretching into the unknown. It was not stone, not light, but something else entirely. A bridge between worlds. Ingrid's voice was barely audible. It wants us to follow. Daniel hesitated. How do we know where it leads? Elias didn't have an answer. The presence did not force them. It did not push, did not pull. It simply waited. The whispers quieted. The choice was theirs. Elias exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, he stepped onto the path. The void embraced him, and the world around them changed. Chapter 10. The Passage Beyond Time. The moment the presence within the door began to move, the air around them thickened, pressing against their skin as if the very fabric of existence had shifted. The door was no longer just an object. It was alive, responding to their presence, sensing them in ways beyond human understanding. The carvings that had once been motionless now pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, their intricate patterns realigning into something new. The whispers in the void did not return, but a low vibration settled into the ground beneath their feet, humming like an ancient mechanism awakening after an eternity of silence. Elias stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the shifting door, his breath steady despite the weight of uncertainty pressing against him. Ingrid and Daniel remained at his side, their movements cautious but unwavering. The figure that had guided them here stood motionless, their translucent form flickering at the edges, as though their very existence was tied to the door itself. Then, without warning, the surface of the door shifted once more, revealing something beneath the layers of symbols and stone. A depth that should not have existed. A passageway that stretched into nothingness, lined with shapes that did not belong in any known world. It was not darkness, nor was it light. It was something else, something that defied explanation. A cold breeze seeped from the opening, though it did not carry the bite of Arctic wind. It carried something older, something untouched by time. The air smelled faintly of stone and dust, but beneath that was another scent, one that Elias could not quite identify. It was not unpleasant, nor was it inviting. It simply was. Daniel exhaled slowly. "We're supposed to go in, aren't we?" The figure beside them did not speak, but its gaze remained fixed on the doorway. There was no need for confirmation. The answer had already been decided the moment they had stepped onto the path. Elias took a cautious step forward, crossing the threshold. The sensation was immediate. The air inside the passageway felt heavier, denser, pressing against him, as though he was walking into a world that did not entirely welcome him. The ground beneath his feet was smooth, unnaturally so, as if worn by the footsteps of countless travelers before him. The walls were lined with the same intricate carvings that had adorned the door, but here they were deeper, more defined. They told a story, one that stretched beyond human comprehension. Ingrid and Daniel followed, their footsteps silent against the ancient floor. The passageway did not echo, sound did not behave the way it should have. It was as if the very air swallowed their movements, refusing to let them disturb the stillness that had existed for untold millennia. As they moved deeper into the passage, the walls began to change. The carvings no longer depicted figures or landscapes. Instead, they became something more abstract, patterns that shifted as they walked, rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer he stared, the more certain he became. The walls were alive, responding to their presence, adapting to them. A sudden pressure filled the air, a deep resonating pulse that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was not a sound, not a vibration, but something deeper, something that bypassed the senses and settled directly into their minds. A presence. Ingrid pressed a hand against the nearest wall, her expression unreadable. "I think it's watching us." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could feel it too. The passageway was not just a path, it was something more. A threshold, a test. The further they walked, the stronger the sensation became. Time itself felt stretched, elongated, as though they were no longer bound to the normal flow of existence. The walls pulsed with a faint glow, their patterns shifting faster now, forming shapes that resembled something close to writing, yet remained just beyond comprehension. Daniel exhaled sharply. "We shouldn't be here." The moment the words left his mouth, the passage responded. The pulse in the air deepened, the glow along the walls intensifying. The shapes twisted, reforming into something new, something that was no longer abstract. A face, not human, not entirely alien, something between. Its expression was unreadable, its eyes empty yet filled with something vast, something unknowable. The walls shifted again, the face dissolving into a series of symbols that moved too quickly to follow. Then the floor beneath them trembled, not violently, not as if the passage was collapsing, but as though something deep beneath them had awakened. The pulse in the air quickened, the glow along the walls shifting from a soft amber to something colder, sharper. A sound filled the space, not a noise in the traditional sense, but something that vibrated through their very bones. A voice yet not a voice. Elias clenched his fists. It's speaking, but it was not speaking to them. It was speaking about them. Their presence had been noted, and something beyond the passage had begun to stir. The air thickened once more, the unseen force pressing against them, urging them forward, deeper into the unknown. Turning back was no longer an option. The passage had sealed itself behind them, the entrance now nothing more than solid stone. There was only one way to go, and whatever waited at the end of the path had been waiting for a long time. Chapter 11. The chamber that remembers. Elias stepped cautiously toward the pedestal, his pulse steady but heightened by the unnatural stillness surrounding them. The chamber was unlike anything they had seen before, vast yet enclosed, open yet suffocating, its walls lined with towering statues that bore no distinct features. Their smooth, elongated faces gave no indication of emotion, their hands raised as if caught mid-gesture. The glow from the carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, illuminating the room in a rhythm that felt deliberate, calculated, as though something unseen was breathing within the very stone. Daniel hesitated near the entrance, his fingers curling into a fist. "This place isn't empty," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ingrid gave him a sharp glance, her own unease mirroring his. It never was. The pedestal in the center of the chamber held their attention, a single artifact resting atop it, a dark sphere, smooth and polished like glass, yet shifting in ways the eye couldn't fully register. Its surface was not truly solid. It rippled ever so slightly, as if mirroring unseen movements beyond their reality. Elias reached out, not to touch it but to feel its presence. The moment his fingers hovered near the sphere, the air around it thickened, as though the chamber itself had sensed his intent. A sound filled the space, not external, but internal, vibrating deep within their bones. It was not a voice, nor an echo, but something far older. It was the sensation of being recognized, acknowledged, and weighed. The carvings along the chamber walls brightened, shifting, rearranging themselves into new forms, new stories. Elias took a step back as the images reshaped into something disturbingly familiar. The three of them were there, their own faces, their own forms, etched into the stone, as though they had always been part of this place. The figures were not merely depictions of travelers or explorers. They were carved with purpose, a reflection of a moment that had already been determined. "This isn't possible," Ingrid said under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "How?" Before any of them could formulate an answer, the sphere on the pedestal pulsed, a slow, deliberate movement, as though something within had just awakened. The statues that surrounded the chamber did not move, but their presence deepened. The weight in the air grew heavier, pressing against their skin like an unseen force. Then, the whispering began. It was not in a language they recognized, yet every word resonated within them, speaking not to their ears but directly to their minds. The walls pulsed again, their carvings shifting once more, depicting something even more unsettling, not just their arrival, but their choices, their movements, the hesitation in Elias's step, the tightening of Daniel's jaw, the way Ingrid's fingers trembled ever so slightly before clenching into a fist. Every moment was recorded in the stone before them, carved as if it had always been there. "It knows," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's watching us." The whispering intensified. The sphere pulsed once more. The statues, unmoving yet omnipresent, seemed to press inward without physically changing position. And then, the words inscribed on the pedestal changed. They had not been there before. They were new, yet ancient, as though they had always existed but were only now meant to be seen. "The chamber remembers. The chamber does not forget. The cycle must be fulfilled." Daniel took a step back. "What cycle? What does it mean?" The whispering grew sharper, no longer just an ambient presence but something closing in, something alive. The walls pulsed again, and the carvings shifted a final time. This time, they saw something worse than their own reflections. They saw themselves standing at the pedestal, their hands on the sphere, and they saw what happened next. Their figures began to dissolve, their bodies unraveling into something less than physical, becoming part of the chamber itself. Their features merged with the stone, their voices fading into the whispers that had surrounded them from the moment they arrived. And then, silence. The chamber remained. The cycle continued. Elias tore his gaze away from the wall. The weight of the knowledge settled heavily on his chest. They were not the first to stand here, and unless they found another way, they would not be the last. The chamber had already decided. Now, they had to make their choice. Chapter 12. The path that was already taken the chamber was quiet, but it was not empty. The air hung thick with something unseen, something expectant, like the weight of countless unseen eyes fixed upon them. Elias felt the pressure of it against his skin, not a physical force but a presence, one that had been waiting for them long before they had even arrived. The carvings that lined the chamber walls had stopped shifting. They no longer rearranged themselves, no longer flickered with ghostly movement. Instead, they had settled into something far worse. They were watching. The figures carved into the stone had changed. Their once static forms now bore expressions of recognition, of expectation. The longer Elias stared at them, the more certain he became that they were looking directly at him. A slow chill crept down his spine. Something had changed. Ingrid let out a shaky breath. This isn't like before. Daniel took a cautious step forward, eyes darting around the chamber. It's not shifting anymore. It's waiting. Elias forced himself to look at the pedestal again. The sphere sat atop it, pulsing with slow, rhythmic waves of light. It was neither glass nor metal, nor any material he could name. It didn't reflect light so much as consume it, shifting and twisting in ways that defied explanation. The moment his gaze landed on it, he felt something stir in the depths of his mind, a whisper, not in words, but in feeling, a suggestion, an invitation. He gritted his teeth and stepped back. "We're not touching that," he said firmly. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Then how do we leave?" Elias turned toward the entrance, but the moment he did, his stomach dropped. There was no entrance anymore. The archway they had stepped through was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken stone. Ingrid sucked in a sharp breath. No, that. She rushed forward, pressing her palms against the cold rock where the exit had once been. "This wasn't closed before." "It wasn't, it's part of the cycle," Daniel murmured, his voice carrying an uneasy certainty. "We came here. We stood here. We saw the carvings. And then," Elias turned sharply toward him. "And then what?" Daniel swallowed. "And then one of us touches it." His words hung in the air like a verdict. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Elias could feel the weight of it pressing into his chest, could feel the pulse of the chamber itself, as if the very walls were holding their breath. No one moved. And then, the chamber moved for them. The carvings on the walls deepened, not shifted, deepened, as if something unseen was still carving them in real time. Elias turned his gaze toward them, his stomach twisting as the images became clearer. They were no longer showing the past. They were showing the future. Their future. The figures carved into the walls were no longer just explorers from long ago. They were them. Elias, Ingrid, Daniel. And they were standing exactly where they were standing now. The carvings were still forming, still changing. Elias watched, breath caught in his throat, as the images played out the next few moments in real time. One of them would reach forward. One of them would touch the sphere. And then, the image became distorted, unclear, as if whatever happened next could not be fully grasped by human understanding. But there was movement, something unraveling, something vast, something reaching through the space between worlds. Elias tore his gaze away, heart pounding. "This isn't real," Ingrid whispered. Elias turned to her. "It is." "Then how do we stop it?" Daniel exhaled. "We can't." Elias clenched his jaw. "We leave." "How?" Ingrid's voice was tight. "There's no door, Elias. There's no way back." He refused to accept that. There was always a way. Always. The silence of the chamber stretched around them like a living thing. And then, a sound. Not a voice, not the whispering from before, but something deeper. A resonance. A vibration. It started in their bones, spreading outward, making the air feel thick, heavy, charged with something unrecognizable. And then, a voice. Not from the walls, not from the carvings, not from anything they could see. It came from the space between sound, a language that had no words, only meaning. Choose. The sphere pulsed. The carvings on the walls deepened further. Their fate had already been decided. They just hadn't reached it yet. Chapter 13. The Passage Beyond Time. The chamber no longer felt like a room but a living entity, something ancient and aware. The air was thick, charged with a presence that could not be seen, only felt. The sphere at the center of the pedestal pulsed with slow, rhythmic waves of light, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The carvings, once frozen depictions of the past, had become something else entirely. They were shifting, not randomly, but with purpose. They told a story, but not one of long-dead explorers or forgotten civilizations. No, these carvings were telling their story. Elias traced the images with his eyes, his pulse quickening. There, etched into the stone, was a depiction of himself, Ingrid, and Daniel. Their figures were unmistakable, carved in unsettling accuracy. In the first set of images, they stood before the sphere, just as they were now. In the second, one of them reached out, and in the third, Elias took a step back. The last image was distorted, chaotic. The figures had changed, elongated, their bodies dissolving into something unrecognizable. Their faces, if they could still be called that, were contorted, caught between expressions of revelation and terror. And surrounding them, woven into the very stone, was a darkness that seemed to bleed out of the carving itself, tendrils of shadow creeping toward the edges of the chamber. A slow, deliberate breath escaped him. "This isn't a warning," he murmured. "It's a prophecy." Ingrid's voice was tight. "Then that means—" Daniel stepped forward, shaking his head. No, we don't know that. These could just be interpretations of the past. Maybe this has happened before, but that doesn't mean it has to happen to us." Elias wasn't convinced. He turned his attention back to the sphere. It no longer seemed like an object, but a presence, something that was waiting. Expectant, the carvings had shown the moment of choice, but not what came after. That, it seemed, had yet to be written. The silence in the chamber deepened, pressing in on them like an unseen force. And then, for the first time since they had entered, something changed. The sphere moved, not a physical shift, but something more subtle. It pulsed with a different rhythm, a response rather than an action. The chamber reacted in kind. The walls vibrated, not violently, but just enough to be noticed. The stone beneath their feet felt less solid, as though they were no longer standing on something entirely real. And then the whispering returned. It did not come from the walls or the carvings, but from somewhere beyond. It was layered, endless, the voices not speaking in any language they understood, yet filling their minds with meaning. It was not a demand. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. Elias's fingers curled into fists. "We don't have to accept it," Ingrid whispered, as if speaking too loudly would make it real. But that was the problem. They had already accepted it. From the moment they had stepped into this place, they had become part of something much larger than themselves. Daniel exhaled, staring at the sphere. What if it's not a trap? Elias turned sharply toward him. What? What if it's a test? Daniel's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something uncertain, yet undeniably drawn to the presence before them. What if the carvings don't show doom, but transformation? What if what we're seeing isn't destruction, but evolution? The whispering grew louder. Elias shook his head. "That's not a risk we can take." Daniel let out a dry, almost bitter laugh. "I think it already has been taken. The only question is whether we step forward or let it decide for us." The chamber trembled again. The sphere pulsed once more, and this time, something changed. A doorway appeared. Not an opening in the wall, not an exit leading back to where they had come from, but something else. It was neither solid nor liquid, neither light nor shadow. It simply was. A passage, but not one that led through space. This was something different. A passage through time itself. Ingrid took a step closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. Is this the way out? Elias didn't have an answer. The whispering had stopped. The chamber was still. The choice, their choice, was upon them. And time, patient as it was, would not wait forever. Chapter 14. The door that was never closed. The air in the chamber was charged with an unseen force, a weight that pressed into their skin and settled deep in their bones. The passage before them, if it could even be called that, was neither open nor closed. It simply existed, waiting, pulsing with a rhythm that was neither of this world nor beyond it. The carvings on the walls had stopped shifting, their meaning locked in place, as if the chamber itself had ceased its whispering guidance. Whatever was on the other side of this threshold did not need to be explained. It only needed to be crossed. Elias felt the pull deep within his chest, not a physical force but a suggestion, an invitation without words. It wanted them to step through, to make the decision of their own accord. His gaze flickered toward Ingrid and Daniel. Ingrid's fingers twitched slightly at her side, as if resisting the urge to reach out, while Daniel's breathing had slowed, his expression unreadable. They all felt it, that same unspoken pull. Does it feel like it's asking us something? Ingrid's voice was quiet but steady. Elias nodded. It doesn't want to force us, it's waiting. Daniel swallowed hard. Waiting for what? Elias knew the answer before he spoke. For us to accept. The idea sent a slow chill down his spine. There had never been a question of escape, only a question of whether they would walk willingly into whatever lay beyond. The carvings had hinted at transformation, at explorers who had stood in this very place and made this very choice. The ones who had refused were not carved beyond that moment. Their stories had ended. But those who had stepped through, their fate was unknown. The doorway pulsed again, a flicker of movement passed across its surface, like a reflection caught in shifting water. It was not a reflection of the chamber, nor of the three of them. It was something else entirely, something moving on the other side. We don't have much time, Elias murmured. Ingrid exhaled slowly. Do we go together? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Always. A pause stretched between them, thick with everything they could not say. Then Elias took the first step. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world around them dissolved. The chamber, the carvings, even the cold itself, gone. It was not darkness that greeted them, nor light. It was something in between, something that stretched endlessly in every direction yet felt confined, as though they had stepped inside a moment that had never ended. There was no wind, no sound, no air. Yet they could move, breathe, exist. Time did not flow here, not in the way they understood it. It bent and twisted, curling upon itself like an unfinished thought. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, not cast by any source of light, but moving independently, shifting through a space that did not conform to logic. Then they heard it, a sound, distant at first, but growing closer. Not a voice, not a whisper, something deeper. A resonance, vibrating not through the air, but through them. It was not speech, yet they understood. It had been waiting for them. Elias turned, expecting to see Ingrid and Daniel beside him. But the space between them had stretched, widened without movement. They were there, but further away than they should have been, separated by an unseen force. He reached out, but his fingers never found them. Ingrid's voice carried across the void. Something's happening. Daniel's form flickered, shifting in and out of focus. We need to stay together. Elias took a step forward, but the space around him resisted, pushing back with a force that had no mass. The passage was shifting, its shape no longer linear, no longer something that could be traversed in the way they had always known. The presence within the void had no form, no shape, yet it was everywhere. Watching, studying, it had not pulled them here. They had chosen this. And now it was waiting for them to take the next step. A flicker of movement caught Elias's eye. A silhouette, standing at the far edge of his vision. It was familiar, unsettlingly so. He turned his head sharply, and the figure moved in kind. A heartbeat later, realization settled deep into his chest. It was him. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but himself, standing just beyond reach, watching him, waiting. A second figure flickered beside it. Ingrid, then Daniel. And more figures appearing in the distance, stretching infinitely in either direction. Endless versions of themselves, caught in the same moment, trapped in a space outside of time. The truth settled in. They had never been the first to step through this passage, and they would not be the last. The presence shifted, pressing closer, not in malice, not in hunger, but in expectation. They had chosen this path. Now they had to find a way to walk it. Chapter 15. The echoes of those who came before Elias stood frozen, staring at the endless figures before him. The realization burned in his mind. These weren't reflections. They weren't illusions. They were real, each one a version of himself. Ingrid and Daniel standing in the same space at different moments, separated by something deeper than time. He turned to Ingrid, whose eyes were wide with the same understanding. Daniel's breath was unsteady, his body tense as though bracing for something unseen. The vast, impossible expanse around them pulsed, its presence neither hostile nor welcoming. It simply was, and it had been waiting for them. "Are they us?" Ingrid whispered. Elias swallowed hard. "I think so, but not just us. Everyone who ever stood where we are now." Daniel let out a slow breath. So this is what happened to them. They weren't lost. They weren't dead. They had become part of this place, caught in its endless loops, its shifting currents. Some stood still, watching silently. Others moved, tracing invisible paths, walking toward unseen destinations. A few seemed frozen mid-step, as though caught between decisions they had never been able to make. A pulse of energy rippled through the space, distorting the figures before them. Some flickered like candle flames in the wind. Others vanished entirely, dissolving into the void before reappearing in a different place, repeating their same silent motions over and over. "They're trapped," Ingrid murmured. Elias nodded. "And we will be too, if we don't figure out what this place wants from us." The presence around them shifted again. It had no voice, no face, yet it pressed against their thoughts, nudging them forward. The versions of themselves in the distance did not speak, but their silence held a message. Not all who entered had found a way out. Elias felt his pulse quicken. "We have to move." Daniel hesitated. "Move where?" Elias turned slowly, scanning the void for something, anything, that felt like a path. There was no obvious exit, no sign of the doorway they had stepped through. The space was vast, stretching infinitely in all directions. Yet it also felt small, as though they were enclosed in something that didn't conform to the rules of space. Then he saw it. A single figure, unlike the others. It stood further away, barely visible, through the shifting currents of the void. It wasn't moving. It was waiting, and it was watching them. Ingrid noticed it too. "That one's different." Daniel's jaw tightened. And not in a good way. Elias didn't hesitate. He took a step toward it. The moment his foot touched the unseen ground, the space around them shifted. The distant figures blurred, their forms distorting, their places rearranging. Some stepped backward, others vanished entirely. But the one that watched them remained. Another step. The void pulsed, the presence around them grew heavier. The figure lifted its head. Elias stopped. The figure was not a shadow, not a ghost. It was human, flesh and bone. A man who had been waiting for them for a very, very long time. His face was lined with age, his eyes dark and hollow. His clothing was ancient, faded and worn, but not of any civilization Elias recognized. The symbols from the chamber were carved into his skin, etched deep as though they had grown there over centuries. He raised one hand, his palm facing outward, and then he spoke. "You must not stand still." His voice was low, brittle, as if it had not been used in lifetimes. The words were clear, but the meaning behind them was heavier than the void itself. Elias's pulse hammered in his ears. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. His gaze flickered past them, toward the countless figures still shifting in the distance. They did not move. They did not choose. They remained. His hand lowered slowly, fingers curling into a loose fist, and now they belonged to it. The presence around them pulsed again, stronger this time. The shifting figures in the void wavered, their forms flickering, dissolving, reforming. The space felt tighter, as though unseen walls were pressing inward. Daniel clenched his fists. "What happens if we don't move?" The man's gaze darkened. "Then you will forget who you are. You will become one of them." Ingrid took a slow step forward. "And if we do move?" The man's expression remained unreadable. "Then you may find the door that was never meant to be found." Elias turned his head sharply. "There's another way out." The man exhaled, a sound that was almost a sigh, almost something deeper. "There is always another door, but only for those who keep walking." The void pulsed again. The figures behind them shuddered, their movements growing erratic. Some turned their heads toward Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel, their eyes hollow and empty. Their bodies twitched as though something had disturbed them. The presence in the void was no longer waiting. It was watching. The man took a step backward, his form beginning to fade. "Do not let it take you. Do not stop, not even for a moment." And then, without another word, he vanished. The presence surged. A low, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through Elias's bones. The distant figures that had once been trapped in their endless loops began to move. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, turning toward the three of them in unison. Ingrid's breath hitched. "Oh no!" Daniel grabbed Elias's arm. "Run!" The first figure lunged toward them. They ran. The void twisted around them, space stretching, folding, breaking apart and reforming in ways that defied logic. The figures gave chase, their movements inhuman, their limbs stretching and snapping forward like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The hum grew louder, the presence pressing down on them with suffocating force. The figures did not slow, did not falter. They had been trapped here too long. They had forgotten who they were, and now they wanted to make Elias, Ingrid and Daniel just like them. The space ahead was shifting. Shapes flickered in and out of view. Archways, staircases, doorways that led to nowhere. The man had said there was another way out, but if they chose wrong, they would never leave. Elias pushed forward, his breath sharp, his legs burning. The void blurred around them, and for the briefest moment, he saw something ahead. A door. Not a carving, not a passage, an actual door, standing alone in the nothingness. But they weren't the only ones who had seen it. The figures behind them moved faster, drawn to the same point. It was a race, and if they lost, they would never move again. Chapter 16. The door that should not exist. Elias felt his breath burning in his chest as he sprinted forward, his mind barely able to process the sheer impossibility of what lay ahead. The door was there, standing alone, unsupported, in the middle of the void. It was tall, dark, and ancient, its surface covered in symbols that pulsed with an eerie glow. It did not belong in this space, yet it was the only real thing here, the only solid anchor in a world that refused to make sense. Behind them, the figures pursued without hesitation. They did not run in the way humans did. Their movements were unnatural, broken, jerky, yet horrifyingly fast. Some twisted forward like puppets with severed strings, their bodies snapping toward Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel with silent, desperate hunger. Daniel stole a glance behind him and let out a strangled gasp. "They're getting closer," Ingrid gritted her teeth. "Then don't stop running." The door was still too far. The space around them was bending, warping, the distance shifting even as they ran. The void itself did not want them to reach it. The closer they moved, the further it seemed to stretch. Elias pushed harder, his legs aching, his mind screaming at the sheer impossibility of it all. "It's moving." "No," Ingrid panted, her eyes fixed ahead. "It's us. We're moving in circles." Daniel cursed under his breath. "Then how do we reach it?" The presence in the void pulsed again, a deep vibration that rattled their bones. The figures surged forward in unison. They were closing in fast. Elias clenched his jaw, forcing his mind to focus. If space here didn't behave normally, then neither should they. Running straight wasn't working. Moving forward wasn't working. The rules here weren't the same. He forced himself to slow down. Ingrid nearly collided into him. "What are you doing? Keep running." Elias shook his head. "No, that's what it wants us to do. We're thinking in straight lines. We need to think in," he exhaled sharply. "Something else." Daniel shot him a bewildered look. "You're seriously talking in riddles right now." The figures behind them let out no sound. No breath, no scream, no growl. But they were so close now. They reached for them, fingers stretching, grasping, their faces still void of expression, yet filled with an unbearable wrongness. Elias shut his eyes. The void wasn't a space. It was a thought. It was a state of being. And if space didn't work the same here, neither did direction. A whisper crawled through his mind, the voice of the old man who had warned them. "You must not stand still." But what if stillness wasn't the same as stopping? Elias took a breath, then stopped moving entirely. His body remained in place, his mind shifting, his thoughts turning. And then, without another step, he moved. Not forward, not backward, but somewhere else. The void flickered, and suddenly, the door was right in front of him. Ingrid and Daniel were still running, still stuck in the loop, their bodies caught in the unnatural bending of space. Elias reached out, grabbing Ingrid's wrist. The moment he touched her, she shifted, her body snapping into place beside him. Her eyes went wide with shock. What? How? Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed Daniel next. The same thing happened. 1 second, he was running. The next, he was here, standing before the door. The figures chasing them recoiled, their movements halting. They couldn't follow. The moment Elias, Ingrid and Daniel had stepped beyond the rules, the figures had lost them. The presence in the void did not like this. The air trembled. The space around them collapsed, the endless abyss rushing inward like a tidal wave of nothingness. The figures that had chased them began to distort, their bodies twisting, unraveling like thread. The void was consuming itself. Elias turned toward the door. "We have to go. Now." Ingrid hesitated only for a second before reaching for the handle. The moment her fingers touched it, the symbols along the wood burned bright, flaring with an unnatural light. The presence in the void screamed, not in sound, but in thought, in feeling, a deep guttural protest that rattled their very souls. Daniel swallowed hard. "I really hope this door goes somewhere better than here." Elias pushed it open. A blinding light consumed them. And then, the world shifted. The cold hit first. Not the hollow, unnatural chill of the void, but something real, something earthly. The bite of the Arctic air stung against their skin, raw and biting. The sensation of solid ground beneath their feet sent a wave of relief through Elias's body. They had escaped. But where had they landed? The light faded, revealing a landscape both familiar and utterly wrong. They stood at the edge of an ancient ruin, one that had no business existing in the middle of the Arctic. The architecture was vast, crumbling, covered in the same shifting symbols they had seen in the chamber below. Towering structures loomed around them, their surfaces covered in frost and ice, yet untouched by the passage of time. And in the center of it all, a second door, identical to the first, but this one was already open. Something had come through, and something else was still waiting inside. Chapter 17. The Ruins of the Forgotten. The Arctic wind howled through the ruins, sweeping across the frozen stone with an eerie, hollow resonance. Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel stood at the threshold of something ancient, something that should not have existed in this place, yet stretched before them in undeniable reality. The ruins were vast, their crumbling structures casting long, distorted shadows under the pale light of the Arctic sky. Pillars of ice-encrusted stone jutted from the ground, their surfaces carved with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly beneath the frost, as if carrying some long-forgotten energy. The second door stood open, its frame dark, foreboding, and impossibly silent. Unlike the one they had stepped through moments ago, this door had not been sealed against the void. It had been waiting. Something had passed through it before them, leaving behind a sense of unease so thick it felt like a weight pressing against their chests. The passage within yawned like the mouth of a great beast, its depth swallowing the light before it could reach the far walls. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching over the frost-covered ground. This place, it doesn't belong here. It's too old, too intact. His voice was quiet, yet the ruins carried the sound far, as though something unseen was listening. Ingrid reached out and ran her fingers over one of the carvings on the nearest pillar. The symbols shifted beneath her touch, rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic, their meanings just beyond comprehension. This architecture, it doesn't match anything we know. It's not Viking, not Inuit, not anything that should exist in the Arctic. She hesitated. It's older. Elias turned his gaze to the structures ahead. They extended far beyond what they could see, fading into the distant white mist that clung to the edges of the ruins like a living thing. Towers with impossible angles loomed over collapsed archways, their surfaces covered in the same strange script. Some buildings had completely crumbled, their remains half buried in ice, while others stood eerily untouched, as if frozen in time. The air felt heavier here. Not just cold, but filled with an energy that prickled against their skin. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. There was no wind, no distant echoes, only the sound of their own breaths and the slow, deliberate crunch of their footsteps. Elias inhaled deeply, steadying himself. We need to find out what's inside. There has to be a reason this place was hidden beyond that void, and I doubt we were the first ones to stumble upon it. He glanced toward the open door, but whatever went through there before us, it didn't come back. Daniel exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the icy air. And you think we should follow? Elias nodded. We didn't come this far to turn back now. Ingrid took a step toward the entrance, her fingers tightening around the strap of her pack. We stay together. No splitting up, no wandering off. The three of them stepped forward as one, crossing the threshold of the door. The moment they entered, the light behind them dimmed, not because of any natural shift, but as though something had sealed them inside. The cold followed them, yet it no longer felt like the Arctic's natural chill. It was deeper, sharper, more invasive. The walls around them were covered in the same pulsating symbols they had seen outside, though here, beneath the shelter of the ruins, they glowed more brightly. The light they emitted was not a comforting one. It was unnatural, casting long, shifting shadows that moved even when the three of them remained still. The corridor stretched onward, impossibly long. The stone beneath their feet was smooth, untouched by time or decay, yet dust coated the edges of the path, undisturbed for centuries. The silence in this place was different, no longer just an absence of sound, but an almost deliberate suppression of it. Even their footsteps felt muffled, as if the air itself resisted noise. Then something shifted, a faint whisper, just on the edge of perception. It was not in a language they understood, nor was it truly a voice, but the sensation of words forming just beyond their reach. The carvings along the walls flared brighter in response, as though the very structure of this place was aware of their presence. Daniel stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Elias nodded, his fingers instinctively reaching for the small flashlight clipped to his jacket. He flicked it on, the narrow beam cutting through the dim corridor ahead. The light illuminated more carvings, more intricate patterns weaving across the walls, converging at points that looked almost like doorways, though they were sealed with something darker than stone, something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Ingrid knelt beside one of the markings, tracing her fingers over the edge of a symbol that resembled an eye. These weren't just made for decoration. their instructions or warnings. Daniel glanced at the sealed doorways along the corridor. Warnings for what? A deep tremor ran through the walls, not from above, not from any natural movement of ice or stone. It came from below. The floor beneath them vibrated, a slow rhythmic pulse, as though something was stirring deep beneath the ruins. The whispering grew louder, not voices, not words, but something ancient, pressing against their thoughts. It did not speak in sound, it spoke in feeling, in memory, in knowledge that did not belong to them yet settled into their minds as if it had always been there. Elias took a slow step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Something's waking up. The sealed doorways along the corridor quivered, the darkness within them shifting, stretching. The light from the carvings flickered as if responding to an unseen force. The air grew heavier, thick with an invisible weight that pressed against them from all sides. Ingrid stood quickly. "We need to move, now." They pushed forward, the corridor ahead narrowing into a vast chamber. The walls of this space were lined with immense carvings, depicting figures that stood impossibly tall, their forms blurred, indistinct. The symbols wrapped around them like chains, binding them to the stone, yet something about the images felt incomplete, as if they were not representations, but reflections. Daniel's breath came unsteadily. "I don't think these are just carvings." Elias turned to him. "Then what are they?" Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze locked onto the largest figure etched into the wall. "I think they're prisoners." A deep vibration rumbled through the chamber. The air around them pulsed with something unseen, something vast, and then one of the sealed doors behind them began to open. The darkness that had filled it was not empty. It moved. It was waiting. It had been waiting for them. Chapter 18. The Awakening Below. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard. It was not an echo, not the shifting of ice, nor the crumbling of stone. It was deeper, an ancient resonance that seemed to vibrate through the walls, through the very air itself. The moment the sealed doorway began to open, Elias felt his stomach drop. The darkness within it did not behave as a simple absence of light. It moved, stretched, and pulsed as though it were alive, spilling into the chamber like liquid shadow. Ingrid instinctively stepped back, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening around the strap of her pack. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, though the words felt useless now. The moment they had stepped into these ruins, their presence had been known. There was no undoing it. Daniel's flashlight flickered as he turned toward the massive carvings along the walls. The figures bound in stone seemed different now, their features more distinct, more present, their elongated forms, their impossible proportions, their hollow, depthless eyes. They were no longer just images, they were something more. Something waiting. Elias forced himself to keep moving. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, the chamber behind them offering no safe retreat. Whatever had been sealed in those doorways had been held there for a reason. And now, the reason no longer mattered. The seal was breaking. A gust of freezing air rushed past them, carrying with it a sound that was neither wind nor breath. It was a whisper without voice, a message without words. The weight of it pressed against their minds, slipping beneath their thoughts, filling the empty spaces with something unfamiliar. It was knowledge that did not belong to them, but had been forced upon them nonetheless. Elias felt his knees weaken for a moment, his vision blurring as the walls around him seemed to shift. He saw things that were not there. Not yet, towering structures rising from an ocean of ice, their spires reaching toward a sky that did not belong to this world. Figures walking along bridges of stone, their forms elongated, their faces featureless, moving with a purpose lost to time. And beneath them, below the ruins, beneath the ice itself, something stirred, something vast. A hand gripped his shoulder, snapping him back to the present. Ingrid's eyes locked onto his, concern etched deep into her expression. "Stay with us," she urged. "We have to keep moving." He nodded, swallowing hard. The visions faded, but their presence lingered. They weren't hallucinations, they were memories, memories of a time before this place had been buried, before it had been forgotten. And if they were real, if they were echoes of what had come before, then the thing beneath them had not been buried to die. It had been buried to wait. Daniel exhaled sharply, gesturing toward the far end of the chamber. There's another passage up ahead. We need to get out of here before. The sound came again. Louder, nearer. The darkened passage behind them was no longer empty. Shapes moved within it, slow at first, then faster. Their forms were undefined, shifting, flickering between solidity and nothingness, like shadows cast by an unseen light. But there was no light. There was only the deep, unnatural void from which they came. Elias clenched his fists, his pulse hammering against his skull. Run. They didn't need to be told twice. The three of them sprinted across the chamber, their footsteps barely making a sound against the frozen stone. The path ahead narrowed into a tunnel, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavier. The symbols carved into the stone pulsed more violently now, their glow intensifying, as if reacting to the presence of whatever was behind them. Ingrid gasped as the tunnel suddenly opened into another vast space, but this one was different. Unlike the ruined chambers they had passed through, this place was untouched. A great platform stretched out before them, its surface polished, reflective like black glass. At its center, an enormous circular mechanism lay embedded in the stone, its surface covered in the same symbols that adorned the ruins above. But this structure was still active. The symbols pulsed in perfect rhythmic intervals, their patterns shifting in ways that felt almost deliberate, almost conscious. Elias hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. He had no idea why, but something deep in his mind told him that this place, this mechanism, was important. It was the heart of the ruins, the core of everything. Behind them, the shadows poured into the tunnel, their forms distorting, stretching, as if the space itself struggled to contain them. The whispers returned, louder now, not distant but close, right at the edges of their minds. Daniel grabbed Elias's arm. "Tell me you know what to do." Elias didn't answer, he didn't know. But his hands moved as if guided by something unseen. He reached out, pressing his palm against the center of the circular mechanism. The moment his skin made contact, a deep tremor ran through the platform. The carvings blazed with a cold blue light, spreading outward in spiraling patterns, and then everything stopped. The air became impossibly still. The shadows at the tunnel entrance hesitated, their movement ceasing as if frozen in time. The whispers faded, the weight pressing against them lifted, and then a voice, not a whisper, not a presence, but a true voice, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very stone beneath them. "You were not meant to find this place." The words were not spoken in any language they knew, yet they understood them perfectly. The symbols beneath Elias's palm shifted, forming new patterns, rearranging themselves as if responding to the presence of the one who had spoken. The entire platform trembled, the circular mechanism turning, unlocking something unseen. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, echoing through the chamber, through the tunnels, through the ruins above. It was the sound of something ancient stirring from slumber. The voice came again, softer this time, but filled with an unfathomable depth. "The seal is broken." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Ingrid and Daniel, his mind racing. The ruins had not been a tomb, they had been a prison, and now that prison was open. Chapter 19: The Descent into the Unknown. As the platform continued its slow, grinding descent, the glow from the chamber above began to fade, swallowed by the increasing darkness below. The air grew colder with every passing second, a damp, heavy chill settling into their clothes, clinging to their skin. The tunnel around them was vast, its walls barely visible beyond the dim blue glow of the symbols that pulsed faintly along the stone. Elias could feel the weight of the world above pressing down, an unshakable awareness that they were sinking into something ancient, something that had not been disturbed for an unimaginable length of time. Daniel adjusted the grip on his flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the thick air. "We should be asking ourselves if this thing has a bottom," he muttered, his voice carrying an edge of unease. Ingrid let out a slow breath, watching the shifting patterns on the walls. "It has to. Otherwise, why build it?" Elias wasn't sure if that was meant to be reassuring or if it only made things worse. The structure they had entered was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It defied conventional understanding, and the more they moved through it, the more it became clear that this place had not been built in any traditional sense. It had been formed, shaped by something other than human hands. The carvings were not mere decorations or records, they were messages, instructions, or perhaps even warnings. The descent stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and yet, despite the time passing, there was no real indication of how deep they had gone. The platform never quickened its pace, never hesitated, never shuddered as if moving over an uneven surface. It was perfectly smooth, steady, an eerie contrast to the rough, time-worn stone that surrounded them. Then, without warning, a low vibration hummed through the air. It was not a sound in the traditional sense, no echo, no reverberation, but something felt deep within their bones. Elias stiffened as it passed through him, an almost rhythmic pulse, as if something was waiting for them to reach the bottom. He exchanged a glance with Ingrid, who had clearly felt it too, her expression shifting from wary curiosity to quiet alarm. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Tell me that was just the structure settling." Elias shook his head. That wasn't the structure. The walls around them began to change. The symbols, once faded and barely perceptible, suddenly flared with renewed brightness. Their forms rearranged, shifting, reforming, the intricate lines no longer resembling the warnings and depictions they had seen before. These were different. These were moving. Elias stared in disbelief as the images restructured themselves, forming new figures that had not been there moments ago. And then realization hit. These weren't just symbols. This was something responding to them in real time, something aware of their presence and showing them something new. The images depicted a vast, sprawling structure, far larger than anything they had encountered so far. At its center was a chasm, an abyss so deep that no light touched its bottom. Figures were gathered around it, standing in rows, waiting, watching. They were not fully human, at least not anymore. Their forms were elongated, their faces hollowed, their limbs stretched in unnatural ways, as if whatever had been down here had changed them, reshaped them into something else. Daniel stepped closer, tracing his fingers over the carvings. "This is a ritual," he said, voice hushed. Whatever they were doing here, they weren't just exploring, they were preparing for something. The vibration came again, this time stronger, almost urgent. The platform was still moving, but the space around them had widened, revealing massive archways leading to unknown corridors. The deeper they descended, the more it became clear that they were not just entering another chamber, they were entering an entire world hidden beneath the ice. And then finally, the platform slowed. The air went still, the descent had ended. A deep, resonant silence stretched out around them, heavier than before, expectant. The blue glow from the walls extended into a vast corridor ahead, illuminating only enough to reveal that the path forward was open. Elias stepped forward cautiously, his boots making almost no sound against the impossibly smooth stone floor. The space ahead of them was vast, stretching beyond the reach of their flashlights, but the scale of it was unmistakable. It was not a single chamber, not just another ruin buried in the ice. It was something much larger. Daniel hesitated, scanning the darkness. So what now? Elias looked back at Ingrid, then toward the unseen depths ahead. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "We keep going," he said, and with that they stepped forward into the unknown. Chapter 20. Beneath the ice veil. The moment Elias, Ingrid, and Daniel crossed the frozen threshold, a sensation of weightlessness overtook them. It was as if they had left behind the known world and entered something untouched by time. The air was neither cold nor warm, but it carried an ancient stillness that pressed against their skin. There was no sound, No wind, no echo of their footsteps, only an immense silence that made them feel like intruders in a place that should not have been disturbed. The cavern before them stretched endlessly, its walls made of something that looked like ice, but shimmered with a strange inner luminescence. The ceiling was impossibly high, vanishing into darkness, while the ground beneath them was smooth as glass, reflecting their own hesitant movements. Shadows flickered, but there was no clear source of light. It was as if the walls themselves were emitting a glow, faint and pulsing, like the breath of something ancient and unseen. Ingrid's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where are we?" Daniel's grip on his pack tightened. "Somewhere we shouldn't be." Elias stepped forward cautiously, his breath steady. He had felt something shift when they had passed through the frozen doorway, something pulling at them, guiding them deeper. The carvings they had seen in the previous chamber had hinted at something below the ice, a hidden truth buried beneath centuries of frost. And now, they were standing in a place that felt removed from the world above, as if the ice itself had created a sanctuary for something forgotten. As they walked, the ground beneath them became uneven, forming intricate patterns, spirals and symbols that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Ingrid knelt, running her gloved fingers over the markings. These aren't just random ice formations. These are inscriptions. Warnings, maybe. Elias studied them carefully. The carvings were unlike anything they had seen before, ancient yet untouched by time, as if whatever had created them had done so moments ago, rather than centuries in the past. There were figures depicted in the ice, humanoid shapes standing in a line, their faces featureless. Above them, a massive structure loomed, something like a monolith or a temple, its jagged form extending beyond the frame of the carving, and beneath them, something else. The figure's feet did not touch the ground. Instead, they seemed to be suspended, hanging in place, while beneath them was only darkness, a vast swallowing void. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This isn't just a story carved into the ice. This is a message, a warning," Ingrid murmured. A sudden shift in the silence made them all freeze. It was not a sound, but the absence of one, the eerie realization that something had changed in the air around them. Elias turned sharply, his pulse quickening. The cavern had been empty just moments before, but now, in the distance, something was standing in the faint glow of the ice walls. A figure. It was motionless, its shape barely distinguishable from the shifting reflections on the icy floor. Its form was elongated, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed just a little too long to belong to anything human. And yet it did not move. It did not breathe. It only watched. "Tell me you see that," Daniel muttered. "I see it," Elias whispered back. Ingrid took a step closer, her instincts torn between curiosity and fear. "It's just standing there." Elias clenched his jaw, or waiting. The moment the words left his mouth, the figure shifted, not a step, not a turn, just a flicker, as if reality had bent for a fraction of a second. One moment it was in the distance, the next it was closer. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. "We need to move, now." They backed away, their steps careful but urgent. The figure did not chase them, but its presence pressed against their minds, an unseen force that made every instinct scream at them to run. The walls around them seemed to pulse in response, the luminescent carvings flickering as if something was stirring beneath the ice. Then the ground trembled, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the cavern, starting deep beneath their feet and rising in intensity. The ice above them cracked, lines forming across its surface like a web of fractures, and then something began to emerge from the darkness below. It was not a creature. It was not a shadow. It was something far worse. The void beneath the ice split open, revealing a mass of shifting shapes, forms that had no definite shape but pulsed with a sentient awareness. They did not crawl. They did not rise. They simply were, their presence seeping through the cracks like smoke, but heavier, more deliberate. The figures in the carvings had warned of this. The void was not just emptiness, it was alive. Elias grabbed Ingrid's wrist, pulling her back. "Go." They ran, their movements frantic as the ice beneath them fractured further, sending splinters of glowing shards into the air. The cavern's walls seemed to stretch, shifting into impossible angles, turning the space into a maze of frozen corridors that had not existed moments before. The figure watching them had not moved again, but its presence had multiplied. Where there had been one, there were now many, standing motionless, watching, waiting. Elias's mind raced. There had to be a way out. This place was shifting, reacting to them. They weren't meant to be here, and whatever was buried beneath the ice was awakening. Ingrid pointed ahead, her voice urgent. There, another passage. A narrow tunnel had appeared at the edge of the cavern, its entrance framed by two jagged pillars of ice. They sprinted toward it, ignoring the deepening tremors and the growing presence behind them. The moment they crossed the threshold, a deafening silence swallowed the cavern, as if the air itself had frozen in place. They didn't stop running. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing and then expanding in unpredictable ways, as if it was shifting around them. The glow from the cavern faded behind them, leaving only the faint luminescence of the ice to guide their way. Elias could feel it now, an awareness pressing against his mind, something trying to reach them, to pull them back. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. They stumbled to a stop, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. The chamber was unlike anything they had seen before. It was circular, its walls lined with towering structures that looked like frozen pillars of ice. But at the center stood something far older. A doorway. Not made of ice, not made of stone, something else entirely. It pulsed, faintly, as if waiting. Elias exchanged a look with Ingrid and Daniel. There was no turning back. Not now. And as the tremors of the cavern behind them faded, they knew one thing. The ice was only the beginning. Chapter 21. The Iceborn Gateway. The three of them stood in silence, their breath steadying as they faced the towering doorway before them. The frozen pillars encircling the chamber reached high into the unseen ceiling, their surfaces etched with symbols that pulsed faintly, casting eerie reflections upon the ice. The structure in the center was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was not ice, nor stone, nor any material they could name. It seemed both ancient and impossibly preserved, as though it had been untouched for millennia. Elias reached out cautiously, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the doorway. It exuded no warmth, no cold, only a presence, an awareness that made the air feel heavier around them. Ingrid and Daniel remained just behind him, their gazes locked onto the strange artifact that pulsed with an almost imperceptible rhythm. It was as if it were breathing, waiting, alive in some inexplicable way. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" Ingrid exhaled slowly. "It's a threshold, a gateway. But to where?" Elias's fingers finally made contact. The moment his skin met the surface, a deep vibration resonated through the chamber. It was not a sound, but a sensation, a tremor that spread through the ice, through their bones, through something deeper within them. The carvings along the pillars responded immediately, their glow intensifying, shifting, forming patterns that rearranged themselves as though awakening from a long slumber. A low hum filled the space, rhythmic and ancient. It carried no voice, no language, yet they understood it. Not through words, but through feeling. "You have come, you have seen, you must decide." The message was not spoken, it was imprinted into their minds, a voice without sound, an echo from beyond time. Daniel took a step back, glancing toward the passage they had come through. It was no longer there. The tunnel had closed behind them, the ice shifting seamlessly into an unbroken wall. There was no turning back. Ingrid looked to Elias. "This is it, isn't it? The thing buried beneath the ice, the thing the carvings warned about." Elias nodded, his gaze never leaving the pulsating doorway. "But we still don't know what lies beyond." A gust of frigid air rushed through the chamber, not from any visible source but from the very walls themselves. The ice groaned, whispering with voices that were not truly voices, just remnants of something that had existed long before them. And then, from the depths of the doorway, shadows began to move. It was not light. It was not darkness. It was something in between, a shifting mass that did not belong to the world they knew. It did not emerge, did not step forward, yet it was suddenly there within the pulsing glow of the gateway. A form, indistinct yet undeniably present. Ingrid's breath hitched. It's watching us. Daniel's fingers tightened around the strap of his pack. Or waiting. Elias steadied himself, his heartbeat slowing as he focused. Whatever this was, it had been sealed away for a reason. The carvings had depicted those who had come before, those who had faced this same moment. Some had gone forward, others had not. The presence within the gateway shifted, and the pulsing hum of the chamber deepened. A single step forward, and they would know the truth. A single step forward, and they would cross the threshold that had remained closed for centuries. But then came the realization, had it been sealed to keep something in, or to keep others out? The thought settled heavily in Elias's mind. If they entered, there was no certainty they would return. If they stayed, the chamber itself might not allow them to leave. He turned to Ingrid and Daniel. This isn't just a passage to somewhere else. This is a test. Daniel frowned. A test for what? Elias exhaled. To see if we should go forward. The humming deepened, resonating through their chests. The shifting presence beyond the gateway did not beckon, did not demand. It simply waited. The carvings on the pillars shifted once more, revealing new figures, 3 of them. They were not frozen explorers of the past, not warnings of what had come before. They were depictions of Elias, Ingrid and Daniel, standing exactly as they stood now, before the threshold of the unknown. And then the ice around them cracked, not with violence, not with collapse, but with purpose. A perfect line traced its way along the chamber walls, spiraling outward from the center of the gateway. The very foundation of the room was changing, rearranging, adapting to the decision they had not yet made. Elias felt it now. This place was not passive. It was aware, and it was waiting for their answer. Ingrid met his gaze. We don't have a choice, do we? Daniel let out a slow breath. We never did. Elias took one last look at the world behind them, the ice, the frozen unknown that had led them here. And then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The doorway swallowed them whole. There was no sensation of movement, no sense of time passing. One moment, they were in the chamber of ice. The next, they were standing beneath a sky that should not have existed. It was not the sky of the Arctic. It was not the sky of Earth. It was vast, shifting, endless. The ground beneath them was not ice, not stone, but something smooth, reflective, stretching infinitely in all directions. Above them, the sky churned, not with clouds, not with stars, but with shapes. Figures moved within it, vast and unknowable, drifting as if suspended in a reality that did not obey the laws they understood. Elias turned to Ingrid and Daniel. They were there, real, solid. But something had changed. The air here was thick, humming, pressing against their skin. The place they had entered was not just a different location. It was a different existence. Daniel took an unsteady step forward. Where are we? A voice answered, though it did not come from any direction. It came from the space around them, from the ground beneath them, from the sky above. You have crossed the threshold. You have chosen to see. The figures above them shifted, watching. Now you must understand. The pulsing hum in the air grew stronger, filling their minds, resonating through their bones. And then, as the world around them began to shift once more, they knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning.